Good evening. It's not my story, why should I care? It's not my story, why should I care? Recreation, destination, fertility, commerce, journey, dividing line. Author and civil rights activist Zora Neale Hurston once stated that nothing that God ever made is the same thing to more than one person that is natural. This quote speaks to the many adaptations that was the Ohio River. However, during this time period of the Underground Railroad, the only name that it had was divider, because it was a divider between slavery and freedom. This is an image of Ripley, Ohio. This image was taken by Henry Howe in 1846. This drawing is a depiction of Ripley, the city known for Underground Railroad activity. This image is courtesy of Union Township Public Library in Ripley, Ohio. Unfortunately, we do not have any evidence or pictures showing Evansville with the Ohio River during the Underground Railroad. We do not have any images of the early settlers or even African Americans during the 1800s. Those sources have yet to be discovered. Descendants of African American history often have difficulty connecting the dots within their family's history, because enslaved people were born into this country without birth dates. Their marriages were not legal, and sometimes they were probably given a proper burial. All of these documents that you would use to legitimize your life story was not afforded to African Americans. Intentionally, a system was designed to deny points of origin and identity, all because their color was not the same as theirs. As we look forward towards the history of Evansville at this time period, sometimes people will ask the question, it's not my story, why should I care? Well, when there were laws designed to segregate the United States, people were denied certain access. In response to those denials, particularly for African Americans, they were able to create their own sense of community. Instead, they were able to create historically black colleges and universities. They created the NAACP and other cultural institutions. Even today, people will ask the question, do these entities still matter? Are these entities still needed? Well, they are still needed. And even though people don't see them as being needed, because in reality, the experiences of African Americans in history, although separate in some times, has always been interwoven into the American experience that is history, and it dates as far back as 1619. Within the state of Indiana, the attractiveness of places like Evansville and Terre Haute and Lick Creek offered opportunities for African Americans to see life without chains. As you look next at this timeline, I want to bring your attention to the year 1820. In 1820, a free group of African Americans, numbering in size close to 96, came to Evansville, Indiana. Past Evansville, they would go further north to Lick Creek. While in Lick Creek, they were able to apply for federal housing through the government. With this housing, they were able to create their own settlement. That settlement would be the Lick Creek African American Settlement. As the years progressed, Indiana would adopt some very harsh black codes. Those black codes would deny African Americans access to education and the right to vote. But within Lick Creek, they continued to survive. Around the 1860s, it was noted that the population in Lick Creek would now triple in size. But what's also to be noted about this Lick Creek settlement is for the fact that it was also intermixed with a white Quaker population. As the next year would forge on, the Civil War would start. At the end of the Civil War, it would bring forth the end to slavery. As the years progressed, the population of African Americans in Indiana was slow but steady. Places like Evansville, Indiana, were on an upswing because of its jobs and opportunities for housing. By the 1900s, Evansville was a very much so attractive place to live. However, catastrophe would strike in 1903 with the Evansville race riots. This race riot was the city's worst in history. Because of this incident, it placed a blemish on the racial progress in Evansville. In spite of these racial climate standings, through the joint effort of these two individuals, they wanted to see Evansville return back to its utopian state. Through the effort of the mayor, William Dress, and the African-American school principal, William Best, they applied for a federal housing grant. Principal Best knew that a part of his students' success in the classroom had to be coupled with a strong home life. He told his idea to the mayor, he agreed, and they put forth the application. That application would become Lincoln Gardens. Lincoln Gardens would act as the second federally funded housing project to be administered through President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Public Works Administration. When this site opened on July 10, 1938, it will replace 11 acres of poor housing and now provide new apartment buildings numbering in the size of 16 different structures that will give African Americans a better life. The feat of Lincoln Gardens was also seen within the community itself. At the heart of the community was a street called Lincoln Avenue. Lincoln Avenue was a hub for African American businesses because at this time, because of segregation laws, African Americans could not shop or be employed in white neighborhoods. Along Lincoln Avenue, if you can just imagine with me as a starting point, the way that we see Evansville today, the starting point would be Martin Luther King Boulevard. And then the end point would be the end point would be Highway 41. And Highway 41 at this time is known as Ferris Avenue. And in the middle was this commercial district along Lincoln Avenue. And along the street was African-American businesses. And those businesses include barbershops, it included grocery stores, restaurants, we had lawyers, doctors, realtors, nightclubs, and hotels. If anything that I would compare it to by today's standards, it would look like the Monopoly game, Boardwalk, because it had that much going on. It was a source of vibrancy. It was a source of community. And that was a good thing. But the reality is the Evansville, Lincoln Avenue that we see today is a shell of its former self. And I know that we're making works to revitalize Evansville, but it's so important that we not forget places of cultural significance. Because if they're overlooked and abandoned, who's going to tell their story? Who's going to remind them of a time that once was? It's not my story. Why should I care? Because oftentimes, stories of people working together, regardless of race, is often overlooked. In Indiana, one of its claim to fame is the Indianapolis 500. Within the Indianapolis 500, history would say that maybe this was a sport for only whites because of its perception and its long history of drivers. However, this gentleman featured here was born here in Evansville in 1897, Charlie Wiggins. Charlie Wiggins would later grow to become a race car driver and a mechanic. He would compete in the colored races known as the Golden Glory Sweepstake. As a four-time champion, he would compete and earn the distinction from fans and fellow drivers as the Negro Speed King. Opting for more competition, he applied for the Indianapolis 500. But because of his color, he was denied admission. This rejection did not deter Charlie Wiggins. Through other means, he found his way to the Indianapolis 500 by working as a mechanic within the pit crew for white drivers. By trademarking the Wiggins Special, he would find a feature that would make cars go faster. Because of this ability, he was a well-sought-after mechanic, regardless of his race. Although Charlie Wiggins was not able to cross the finish line himself, his work did pave the way for future drivers of color to compete in the Indianapolis 500. It's not my story, why should I care? This question alone was further compounded by the fact that within American museums designed to preserve history, they were virtually silent on the study of African American history. And the reasons being, it was because the problems that were associated with African American history. One being for the fact that, unlike any other ethnic group to make its way through Ellis Island, African Americans are the only one to be forcibly removed from Africa through the Atlantic slave trade and brought to the United States. Further compounding this problem of not wanting to deal with the history of African American history is the fact that for some of these officials, they didn't want to deal with the topics of racial violence or segregation or slavery. So instead of not dealing with these topics, museum officials opted to avoid history, or at least not to create history in its inclusiveness. However, their avoidance would have to come to terms with the airing of Roots. Roots was Alex Haley's best-selling book that basically chronicled one of his ancestors that he was able to track down through genealogy and oral histories. With this research, he was able to basically find his original African ancestor. Through the miniseries, they were able to tell the enslaved experience from their point of view. Each night, large numbers of viewers would tune in to check out this miniseries. Upon its conclusion, people would say that this was their first time seeing the stories associated with the personal suffering and the violence of slavery. In response to the miniseries Roots, African American community leaders and civic groups began to make demands on museum officials to now show exhibits, well, at least for African American history, to have more agency and voice. They wanted this veil of silence to be lifted. They wanted to show the stories connected to the issues of slavery. And so they pushed, and they got it done. Because by the time the 1980s was over and we're entering into the 1990s, there are now institutions that are showing more inclusive exhibits, but some are still practicing in silence. In Southwest Indiana, there was a small group of community activists spearheaded by Sandra Matthews to stop the silencing of Lincoln Gardens. Lincoln Gardens had fallen into grave repair and was set to be demoed. Through their efforts, they were able to save one unit. That one unit became the Evansville African American Museum. When this site was opened in 2007, a remarkable feat was achieved. For the fact that a place like Evansville, Indiana, to have a cultural institution changed the scope of scholarship. Oftentimes, places of significance is often credited to the major cities of the North. Those major cities include Harlem, New York, Chicago, Illinois, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Detroit, Michigan. Places like Evansville changes the narrative because it shows the movement of African Americans to be in places of smaller destinations or lesser known fame in the Midwest. It's not my story, why should I care? Because in the real sense, all life is interconnected. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied to a single garment of destiny. This quote by Dr. Martin Luther King speaks to the importance of the fact that what affects one directly can affect all indirectly. Human connections and humanity and altruism are interconnected. What someone does, what their life choices could affect others. This story of Dr. Martin Luther King and what he's trying to show is all a part of history. History has to be the timeline for changes. History has to document places, people, and things. And it has to be prepared and preserved in its entirety. Cultural sites have an obligation as well to talk about the stories of profound tragedy and sorrow. Within the life of Frederick Douglass, he talked about that profound tragedy and sorrow, and I will share a little bit from that excerpt. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother. It was a common custom during slavery to part children from their mothers at a very early age. The mother is taken to a far-off location or hired out to another plantation. The child is placed under the care of an old African-American woman too old to work the fields. For what this separation has done, I do not know, unless to hinder the development of a child's affections towards its mother, and vice versa for a mother towards her child. I can't recall seeing my mother in the light of day. In fact, I can only recall seeing my mother 4 times. She would lie down next to me and get me to go to sleep, but before long, when I woke up, she was gone. I was 7 years old when my mother died. I was not present in her illness or at her death or burial. She was long gone before I knew her. I received the tidings of my mother's death with little emotion. She was like my mother, but I felt like she was a stranger to me. This profound statement made by Frederick Douglass speaks to the condition of human suffering associated with slavery. The tactic of withdrawing love from someone is an act of violence. It's an emotional abuse. At this time period, the need to have a workforce, work in the fields forcibly to produce a cash crop was more important than a loving connection between family members. That is our nation's ugly truth. It's not my story. Why should I care? Because sites like the Evansville African American Museum, along with other cultural institutions, have to provide the narrative that speaks to the audacity of hope. The audacity of hope acts as the ending for Frederick Douglass's life, because in the end, he was able to successfully escape from slavery. From there, he would go on and tour through speeches. And with these speeches, he was able to transform hearts and minds to bring forth an end to the peculiar institution. That is the importance of Frederick Douglass, but most importantly, because of his abilities to transform hearts and minds, he was noted as the most influential African American of the late 19th century. It's not my story. Why should I care? Well, remember the next time that you're at the river, be sure to listen to the rippling waves, because behind the waves, there is a story. Yes, the river is a force of nature, and amphibians and fishes call the water its home. Yes, the river can be used for a source of recreation. Yes, the river could speak to many things. The river can even be considered a passage for the reflection of time. Of all those things the river can speak, it can speak to a lot. Author and activist Marcus Garvey once stated that a people without knowledge of their past history and culture are like trees with no roots. We must have a lot of roots in the ground, because if we have a lot of roots in the ground, the foundation cannot be eroded. If you kill or cut down a lot of trees, the foundation is not strong. In order for us to have life, we must have roots. Thank you.